Well, we start first of all with a philosophical or theological position that state education, by definition, shouldn't exist. We think that we believe in jurisdictions, and in theology, a jurisdiction is what God has assigned certain things to be conducted in certain places and ways. And we think that education of children belongs to the family and the church, or to private associations and not government. And if we look at early American history, we had no state-sponsored public education till around the 1830s or 1840s in the New England area. It started in Boston. Prior to that, all the education was provided by churches, families, and private associations. And it was started by Horace Mann, and we kind of dated around 1840 in Boston. And he was a Unitarian, which means he was not a Trinitarian, which is what Christians are. And he was also a socialist. And he's considered by all to be the father of public education. So we want him to be credited. And from that point on, it just sort of spread through the culture and through New England and the North, and then after the Civil War, it was imposed on the South as part of radical Reconstruction. The South had no public schools, but and the North and the South had primarily a universal school system, but it was private and operated on the free market. So that's a little bit of the history. So we'd start off with jurisdictional argument. Churches know if the state passed a law saying that they were going to offer the sacraments on Sunday and they wouldn't be needing their clergy anymore, we'll send the trash men around to do the sacraments in your churches, people would rebel. But some might say, oh, I guess it's okay if they put on clean clothes and take a bath. But this is absurd, and this is what we've done with the education of children. We've handed it over to the state, and it doesn't belong to them. So we're trying to correct that, and that's the fundamental argument we made, and that public education is a usurpation of the rights of families, churches, and private associations. Well, that is a massive problem. It's an extraordinary and massive problem. I finished high school in 1961, and we still had chapel once a week or once a month in a public school. We had prayer and Bible reading every day in homeroom, and it was a moral environment. You wouldn't call it a Christian school because they didn't use Christian curriculum, and Christ wasn't central to the program, but it was a level playing field. Christianity was one of the players, and shortly after that you had the famous prayer and Bible reading decision where Christianity was officially expelled from public education. But even on through the 60s and maybe even some into the 70s or 80s, public education, even though it was a Christian, it still had a traditional and classical pedagogy. 2 + 2 was 4. And we studied history, real history, and we studied real grammar and real mathematics. And so you could get a good education in many of our public schools through the 60s and 70s, even though it wasn't Christ-centered and Bible-based. And so now the system is just totally overrun with secularism, Common Core, LGBT, Howard Zinn's People's History of America, I believe is what the title is. He's a Marxist. That's a very widely used history book for American history. All these things have just come in, and it's just like all the debris and waste of decades have just washed up on our shores all at once. And so people are sort of stunned about what's happening morally, spiritually, and academically now. They are changing away for years from traditional pedagogy and the classical model of education, which even public schools held to for many, many years. So the system's got to go. And we've got to go first. We've got to get our kids out and get them into the safe sanctuary of Christian and homeschooling, or we're going to lose the whole next generation. Yeah, that's the third big hurdle I face. There's a lot of good-hearted conservative people, even many Christians, think we can't give up on state education. And my view is it's improperly constituted. It's a socialistic model. State education, by definition, is socialism in education. Free market conservatives don't believe in socialism in medicine or any area. We believe that the free market, government has law enforcement responsibilities, they have military and justice, but they don't have education. They shouldn't be running health care either. So we take the same argument on education we would on health care. So we don't want them in this area. It's an illegitimate function of government. It's a usurpation of the family, the church, and the free market. So we don't think it can be fixed. And we've watched reform movements. This is the conservatives have tried to reform the public schools going back into the turn of the 20th century, even from John Dewey, and it's just been like running on a treadmill. And they're starting to look real silly because the more they work at reforming the public schools, the sillier it looks. And I'm finding now more and more people that have been reformers are being dragged kicking and screaming into my camp because the reality, they've been mugged so many times that they finally just realize, hey, this is not working very well, and I'm starting to look real silly. So I think we're seeing more and more people being converted to the idea of getting out and a separation of school and state, and that the system can't be fixed. And we believe there's a possibility, we cannot prove this, it's sort of a guess, that if we could get 30, 35, 40% to leave and go strictly into private, Christian, and homeschooling, one of those choices, that the public system would implode and collapse. And then the government would be forced to give up state education entirely, and we'd move back into the original American model, which is no state education. For 200 years, we had only private free market and Christian education. And that also happens to be the biblical model. Yeah, one of the big threats as we grow and become more and more successful, the government will start offering help. And beware of the government whenever they offer help. So one of the threats is that many conservatives want the voucher. And I'm against the voucher because it will be a subsidy to private schools, and they will use that at some point over a decade or so to take control of private education again. And frankly, this is how we got public education, because all the schools in America in the 1840s, 1850s, 60s, they were private schools. And the state or the local government started funding them, and after a decade or so, they weren't private anymore, they were public. And so we don't want funding from the government. But we have to fight our friends on this, because a lot of good people say, oh, we've got to have the voucher. And we think that the churches can subsidize it, foundations, and if it was on a free market, the costs would go down. See, socialism drives costs up and quality down. So if we had free market education, if you had a bad school, you'd have to go out of business. But today, if you're running a bad public school, they say, oh, we're doing a terrible job. The kids are not learning. There's lawlessness and anarchy in the schools. Give us more money. We're going to tax you more for the schools that are not working. This is crazy. And that's how the liberals think. But with a free market system, if they were doing a bad job, they would have to close.